It's Wednesday, November 30th, 2022. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. Joining me behind the camera today is Alex Stevens, doctoral candidate in history at the University of Michigan. We're on the campus of Montgomery Bell Academy in Nashville, Tennessee with Dr. Tim Boyd. Dr. Boyd received his undergraduate and master's degrees from Oxford University in the United Kingdom before earning his PhD in history from Vanderbilt University. Formerly a lecturer of American Studies and Political Culture at Vanderbilt, he is currently Associate Head of School, Academic Dean, and History Teacher here at Montgomery Bell Academy. His book, Georgia Democrats, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Shaping of the New South, was published in 2012 by the University Press of Florida. Dr. Boyd's work has also appeared in the Journal of Southern History, as well as Painting Dixie Red, When, Where, Why, and How the South Became Republican, which was edited by the late Glenn Feldman. I'll add on a personal note that his work proved very invaluable to me as I researched and wrote my own doctoral dissertation on the Georgia Republican Party, so I owe him a debt of gratitude, which is partially paid off today with this interview, which I'm sure we will paint him in a perfectly glowing light. So, Tim, thank you so much for inviting us here to campus to talk history and politics and maybe sports and other things. I don't know. We'll see where it takes us. Tell us about your childhood and upbringing in the UK. You said you grew up in London. Whereabouts in the 30 or so boroughs of London?
Well, first of all, thank you also for being here. I appreciate being a part of this project. I think it's a great one to do, and you're a great person to be having doing it. I grew up in Haringey in North London. The most famous celebrity near there is Karl Marx, who's buried a few miles away from where I grew up in Highgate Cemetery. Went to elementary school there and high school there. Spent 1 year in Germany. My mother was German, so I speak German as well thanks to that. And my dad had been a history major at college, and I think that's probably, even from an early life, set me on the path to wanting to study history as well.
So what did your parents do while you were growing up?
My mother was a special needs teacher part-time, so she taught kids with dyslexia in elementary schools, and my dad was an official at the Department of Health, a civil servant in Whitehall in London. Okay. And did that for 30 years. So, as a civil servant, obviously politics was a little more complicated than your average citizen, but did you grow up in a family that was very interested and active in politics? Yes. In fact, either evidence of a wasted childhood or a precocious one, but I remember at the age of 8 there was a general election in the UK, and my dad was very invested, and he was still is a member of the Labour Party, and my grandmother was campaigning as well, and she lived in Finchley, which was Mrs. Thatcher's constituency. Yes. At that point, she was maybe the one Labour voter living in Finchley. But I remember, them both being very disappointed at the outcome of that election. So even from that age, I remember being dragged off as a kid. The Labour Party used to do these book sales, fundraising book sales, just out in the street, sort of like flea market type of things, and standing there on cold winter mornings, even as a kid. So definitely a good tradition of that growing up.
I'm sure your grandmother had a portrait of Neil Kinnock up on the mantelpiece and everything.
She did. And I should also, so my grandfather was he'd long retired by then, but he'd been the political editor of The Guardian in England. So he'd also written a lot. He wasn't active at that point anymore really, but he'd written an awful lot.
Oh, I'm sure.
In his time.
So you mentioned, your father being a history major. Do you think that's where your interest and love of history came from, or do you remember that moment you're like, I want to grow up and be a history major and a history teacher when I grow up, as all little boys do?
Yes, it's the dream. People talk about sports or astronaut. No, underneath all that is the desire to be a history teacher. I don't know that I'd thought as a kid or a teenager that necessarily it would be teaching, but I can't remember not being interested in history in some way. I remember enjoying the school trips we might do as a kid to places in London that were historically themed. I remember when the Ken Burns series on the Civil War came out, I think I was 10, and my dad was hooked on it because he was massively into history as well. And I just remember really looking forward to that being out every week.
Yeah.
So I always, whenever there was a chance to study history at school, I wanted to do it. I pretty much knew I wanted to study it at college. I don't know if at that point I was already thinking, and it will be the career beyond that. But
so, what was it that led you to gravitate towards history of the United States or American history?
Well, probably partly that the Ken Burns series. I remember that Christmas getting a copy of the Battle Cry of Freedom, thinking that was
as every 10-year-old
again
does
dreams of, and actually reading it in full and thinking this was very exciting, and perhaps been wondering why I don't know, Lego or Tickle Me Elmo was more popular with some of the others, but. Yeah, so that was certain interest in U.S. history even then, and then the real kind of spark for it came in college. I took a course in history of the United States since 1865, and the professor for that course was a man named Ewan Green. He was mostly a British historian, a historian of British politics, but he'd also written some on the U.S. and studied there, and he was fantastic. So he used to ask us every week, you'd have to write an essay. And he'd ask these really short but just really fascinating questions to get involved. I remember the very first one was simply the Republican Party, the rise of the Republican Party made the Civil War inevitable. Do you agree? That was the first assignment, right? So it was all these kind of, and that became the most interesting class I took as an undergraduate.
Fantastic. So you were at Oxford. Which college were you at?
St. John's.
So for an interested but ignorant American such as myself, does one apply directly to the college, or is it the university and you get placed in the college, or certain majors in certain college? How does that work?
So for Oxford and Cambridge, most people apply to a particular college, which there's typically, I think there's about 30 colleges in each one. So you can apply to the pool, so you can indicate you have no preference which college, and that's a general application, but that's relatively unusual. Typically you apply to a specific set of one to three colleges. Most of them offer all majors. There are some slightly quixotic ones that don't offer English, for example, as a major. Some of the more niche topics, chemical engineering might not be offered by every. That's probably not a niche. That's a historian saying that's a niche topic, I think. I was trying to think of something.
Those
the sciences.
These STEM things
right.
People keep talking about.
Some of the more particular sciences are not offered everywhere.
So you were studying, history of the United States at Oxford, and was this? When did your interest in Southern history and Southern politics and American politics, was that at the same time? Did you have a capstone or a thesis project that you did as an undergraduate?
It was not a thesis. It wasn't a capstone as such. It was the last essay of that class.
Okay.
And I think up to that point, I remember we did one on the rise of the Civil War, outbreak of the Civil War. We did one on Reconstruction, populism, the New Deal, and these were all relatively familiar topics. And to some extent, also, they felt like there were parallels in European and world history to them that I'd encountered before. Not identical, but obviously industrialization, the Great Depression, all those things. And then the very final essay topic was, and again, typically he loved these short questions, it was explain the transition in Southern partisanship from 1944 to 1980.
This was incredible practice for comprehensive exams.
It really was.
In U.S.
And so I remember, looking at all these electoral maps and being a sort of politics geek already.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, I don't know of any other instance of something like the Solid South, and I couldn't think of a parallel, so that made me more interested in it. Mm-hmm. And then just, trying to untangle it with relation to the civil rights movement in particular, which I was also interested in. I think it gnawed at me as the question. Like, I didn't feel that one essay had really. Amazingly, I was modest enough as a 20-year-old to be like, I don't know that my 6-paragraph essay here has actually fully answered this question. There may yet to be more to be found out and more to say.
As a brief aside, you're talking about the Solid South and whether it's unique. Thinking about the 2019 general election in the UK and the Red Wall,
right,
and the solidly labor, rural, small town voters, which have been trending towards, if we want to call them the conservative parties or the right-wing populist parties, is sort of a delayed reaction of the realignment that's been going on in the United States, which is in the rural countryside, which was the backbone of the Democratic Party, breaking away and realigning with the Republicans. I don't know what to do with that. Maybe there's a graduate student who's listening to this who wants to make a comparative study.
Yeah, someone
at
with
some point.
Yeah, perhaps. So
Somebody with more time than Tim and I.
Yeah, just one quick thought on that. I think it is interesting that for the most part there are rural areas in the UK that are not especially wealthy. Those tend to be. There's more of those in Wales and Scotland. Mostly rural parts of England have been. The southeast and southwest in particular have been conservative parts, and they're fairly prosperous. And what's interesting, the Red Wall is often a lot of sort of former industrial towns. It's the
Rust Belt.
The Rust Belt. I think
North.
so. The Rust Belt phenomenon might be closer.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's not been. It came as a shock in 2019. So definitely a rich vein of research there.
Well, we'll see if there's a snapback. If the polls are to be believed,
Yes.
I think Starmer's in good position there, and it's the blue wall that it's probably going to crumble.
It's a little rickety at the moment.
Yeah, but 2 years is a long time in politics.
Yeah.
So, did you stay at St. John's to do your master's?
I did. I actually, for 1 year, went and worked in Parliament as a researcher
wow.
for a member of Parliament, and then still felt that was a really interesting job. But I was still interested in pursuing the intellectual academic life a little bit more. So applied for a master's.
What year were you at Westminster?
2000, 2001.
2001. Okay, so that's the first Blair government.
Yeah.
So I assume you interned for a Labour MP?
Yes. He was a member of Parliament for Hove, which was a seat that I don't think it ever had a Labour MP until 1997. But since then has actually been one of those southeastern places that's trended Labour, even as the Red Wall is not.
Right.
So working for him.
What kind of things did you work on? Where you?
Speech writing, constituency events, research on topics that he was interested in.
Yeah.
And running his office in Westminster, basically, which is not anyone. I mean, that if you're familiar with American congressional offices, that sounds a pretty grand thing. It's not quite the same.
Well, I think again, congressional offices. What I'm always truly amazed at is you go to these offices and they're being run by 20-somethings. And I remember the first time I went to a congressional office and I was the oldest one in the room, and something is wrong.
Yes.
this can't be right.
These are the
adults
people in
must
charge.
be in just the room beyond here doing something very important. But it sounds like it's something similar. Probably similar all across the world, really. So you took that year at Westminster and went back to delve into the life of the mind some more. What was your project on for your master's?
So the master's project was specifically on the national democratic leadership in the 1960s, trying to navigate civil rights.
Right.
So that was a longer, more of a thesis itself, but that focused very much on the '64 convention, pretty well-trodden territory. But it was so the LBJ tapes had really, I think, become available. I want to say '96, '97, something like that.
Yeah.
And so that was the big draw, was being able to use those. And of course, a fantastic resource that's now pretty well established. At the time, it felt cutting edge and And
this is before Beschloss even had the edited books out.
I think they just started to come out around this time. Yeah.
So okay, so from there, you're pretty much looking at the Democratic Party, civil rights, sort of the nexus of race and politics. When did you decide that you were going to go to the United States to study Southern history and Southern politics?
I should probably...
Or say American history, American politics. The exact topic, of course, comes at a later date, I'm sure.
Yeah, I feel I should have a more profound answer to that question, but the basic one is it felt slightly dishonest to be studying that without coming to the US. And I had an advisor at Oxford who'd spent time at Vanderbilt. And so when we were talking about that, and he sort of said, well, it also came as news to me that American universities offer stipends for graduate students. Which was an important
There's a big difference
part of this as well. So he recommended Vanderbilt, and I applied there, got in there. And I also knew by that point, recognized several of the names on the Vanderbilt faculty as being, pretty titanic figures in the field.
Yeah, you mentioned before we started talking, when you applied, Dewey Grantham was still active, Paul Compton was still active, but that didn't turn out to be the committee that you had.
No.
Unfortunately, although Dewey Grantham is one of those figures. He studied with Fletcher Green at the University of North Carolina, and then my advisor's advisor, Newman Bartley, studied with Dewey Grantham here at about 2 miles that way at Vanderbilt. So a fantastic scholar of the Solid South. So you come, how do you wind up studying Southern politics? Is it just the proximity to the resources?
Yeah, and I think by that point, studying the national response had been interesting, but there was also, there was a lot of literature, both journalistic and historical, about, LBJ and King and the civil rights movement and the politics of it, and I didn't feel there was quite as much on the state level, and so it felt, and I was also given some pretty strong nudges by the faculty, like, pick something manageable, right? The first pitch was, why don't I travel to all 11 southern states and see what, and that was, in true southern, politeness, firmness, kind of a bless your heart kind of response. So why don't you pick one or maybe two? And I did consider doing, trying to do Tennessee and Georgia, just because that would have been
sure.
But it turned out, honestly, that there was so many resources located in Georgia that there was enough to do that, given the time span. The choice was essentially maybe do a narrower time span and a broader geography, or a broader time span and a narrower geography.
The choices that we are confronted with as graduate students, as Alec well knows too. So Georgia, and so this is the real nub here is, why Georgia? Is it just the resources, or was it something else about, say, the cast of characters, the Democratic leadership, the character of the Democratic Party that really interested you?
Yeah, I think there was as well as the resources being accessible and widely available, it also felt like if you were going to pick kind of a state that represented, obviously each state story is different, but if you were looking for a state,
VOK, as we well know,
that represented enough of the major trends, I felt that Georgia was a very good fit. I felt it had some of the most prominent sort of resistors, Russell, Talmadge, Maddox, any of those. It had some of the most significant transitional Democratic figures, so from Ellis Arnold through to Jimmy Carter and beyond, and obviously major civil rights leaders in there.
Right.
It had that blend between the emerging metropolis and the rural areas, but also that rural split between the Appalachian regions and the Black Belt and the coastal regions. So it felt like not everything that happened in Georgia happened everywhere else, and nor does Georgia cover everything that happened, but all the trends that mattered were there somewhere.
Right.
And so it felt like it was an easier case to make than, let's say, Tennessee or Mississippi.
Right.
Where you might have had, not that whole mix.
Right. Whereas, sure, if you go to Mississippi, there are those things, but the suburbs of Jackson, Brandon and whatnot are not. This isn't Marietta. This isn't DeKalb County.
And I just
no offense to those areas in Mississippi, of course.
But looking at the political behavior as well, that Georgia is in 1948 is like the one deep South state that doesn't go Dixiecrat, but it's the most Dixiecrat of the Truman Southern states. And then in '64 it does go for Goldwater, but it's the least of the. So it's in that kind of. Playing in the center of the field, kind of.
Right. Yeah, and I agree, and that's something that, when doing the Republican Party and trying to figure out, it's more indicative of those larger trends than, say, in Alabama, which elects 6 Republicans in '64 and '66, because it's the trends are just different. So did you have any topics that you sort of discarded before you landed on, apart from your 11 state study of democratic politics?
I don't. I think that was I think I knew I wanted to do the reaction of the Democratic Party to civil rights, and I knew I wanted to do it at the state level and roughly that time span. And I can't remember. Maybe at one point I was toying with going all the way through the 1980s. But I think
right. I mean, periodization is. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to periodization, and it often just comes down to: do you want to finish your dissertation before your funding runs out?
Yes.
Well,
this is why this year is crucial. It's just as far as I got in the archives.
Right. That's a dirty little secret that we just let out. So, no notes, no time limit. What's your thesis? What was the thesis and conclusions of your work, your dissertation, which later became, of course, the book?
So the larger argument was about the nature of the change that the civil rights movement produced, and who were the key figures in shaping that change. And I felt, in the dissertation in the book, the white backlash narrative is kind of the standard one, and there is, obviously race plays a huge role in Southern politics. Mm-hmm. My feeling was that the typical telling of that story got it to the point where it crowded out everything else as playing a significant role. That it narrowed the time window a little bit too much into the 1960s, as if to say, there was Solid South up to about late 50s, and then suddenly, pow, there's this explosion, and then, nothing is the same after that. And that it also kind of took the agency and gave it entirely to, in a sense, Southern strategy Republicans. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the Southern strategy Republicans are a big part of the story. But one of the things that I sort of felt early on, and especially reading some of the works by Matt Lasseter and others like it, were, a lot of these Southern strategy Republicans failed. And the ones who succeed are pretty dramatic and exciting and big controversial figures, and so they get a lot of attention. But if you actually look at the landscape of Southern politics in the 70s and 80s, at the state level at least, they are the minority group still. Mm-hmm. And it's these, Jimmy Carter-style Democrats.
Right, yeah, the New South Democrats.
And that I felt that story had continued through the 1990s, really, and then there's another hinge point. So the argument was essentially, the white backlash is a major political force, but it's not the only one. The transition is a longer-term one than just Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act and Southern politics is upended. Mm-hmm. I know that's simplifying, but that's the moment where it all happens, and that the key figures are not simply the Jesse Helmses of the world, the Jimmy Carters, the Dale Bumpers, that these are actually Sam Nunn, another one. Right. These are the people who are more representative of the typical trend in Southern politics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As
opposed to, your article in the Journal of Southern History about Lester Maddox in the mm-hmm. 66 election. Tell me about that. Remind our listeners, 66 election. You talk about an incredible hinge point, because that's something I always talk to especially members of the Georgia Republican Party who were active in the 60s and 70s about what it would have meant had Bo Calloway been able to get 50% plus one and take the governor's mansion. And instead of 1966, they wait until 2002 when Sonny Perdue wins the governor's mansion. What would that have meant to the party and partisan development and development of the two-party system in Georgia? And it's always interesting to get their thoughts. But talk to us about the 1966 election and how that sort of white backlash thesis had been applied, and then sort of what your intervention, using the thesis that you're applying, how you can give us that spin on 1966.
So I think the crucial thing with 66 as an election is it is a very weird election, and it doesn't really go with the long-term pattern of what's happening in Georgia, but it's so weird, it's so dramatic. Mm-hmm. Maddox is such a disruptive mm-hmm. and colorful figure that I think it draws attention as being like, this is the embodiment, right? This is what's going on. And I think my main argument in that article was, apart from its very weirdness, that it's actually somewhat unrepresentative, right? So Maddox is not your typical Georgia Democrat of that time. He's really a sort of a celebrity politician.
Yeah.
He has no traditional base. He's not actually the continuation of Herman Talmadge as such, and there are so many twists and turns.
There were Talmadge candidates, right?
Yeah.
He was sort of the
he withdrew himself, right?
Yeah, Maddox was a meme candidate before we had a meme.
Exactly, and Talmadge, I mean, there was a lot of speculation that Talmadge was going to run, and he dallies with it.
And the Coca-Cola folks and the big mules are saying, you stay on the finance committee and the ag committee.
And I would imagine he would have been a strong favorite.
Ernie Vandiver was the early favorite, and he had a heart attack.
Right. So all these, like the field is cleared in very unusual ways. The primary is hotly contested. The Republicans have a pretty strong candidate, sort of classic suburban business interests kind of candidate, and then you have this, this write-in effort that, this group that's basically arguing for a write-in for Ellis Arnold, a more liberal force that's basically what costs Callaway probably getting to the amount that would have won.
Yeah, that's pretty firmly established that. Those
Without
folks
that.
would have either stayed home or voted for Callaway.
And then the trajectory that then puts the Democratic Party on in Georgia in terms of the confrontation with Maddox that comes 2 years later. So all those things are really, really messy. I also think it's the classic white backlash narrative will also sort of sometimes single out 66 as being like, well, here's the wave of the future, right? This is the breakthrough moment. But as you already mentioned, for Georgia Republicans, that's a high point for 40 years.
Oh yeah.
They will not have as many congressmen as they get from that election until the 90s again.
1990.
And they won't win the governorship until 2002. And for the Democrats, in the moment, it feels like a train wreck. Or for what will become the leadership of the party, and actually, honestly, the existing leadership. But it actually, and ultimately, I would argue, helps them establish control with the backlash against Maddox. And from 1970 through the 1990s.
Yeah, that's a good point you make about the Republican Party. So it's funny because on the one hand, you have the Republican Party expecting these trends to continue. 68, you can see that, well, if we just add the Nixon vote with the Wallace vote, we'll win. And you also have Jimmy Carter learning the lessons of 66. Jimmy Carter was also in that primary in 66, came in third, I believe. And he's looking at 66 and 68 and runs against one of those transitional figures, Carl Sanders. And Republicans think that 70 is it. And you talk about the failed Southern strategy candidates with Jimmy Bentley, one of the party switchers. The Capitol clique, as they called them back then, and Bo Callaway's like, here's our guy. He's an elected Democrat. He's young. He's handsome. He's proven. And the Republican Party is like, well, we don't want that guy.
Right.
I mean, he's a Dixiecrat.
Yeah, I think that's that. When your book comes out, I think that'll be a vital part of that story as well. On the Republican side, I think that 1970 primary is just a fascinating moment because it does show you that there's there's part of the party that's like, hey, we've been here 25 years.
Oh yeah.
And no, we're not just handing it over to
the DeKalb County crowd. Where when you're talking about the Republican Party primary voters, you were talking about a subset of a subset of a subset of voters. 1970. That's early. That's the first statewide primary the Republicans have ever run.
Yeah,
it's a fascinating story. We actually have a panel proposal for Charlotte for the Southern, and my paper's on the 1970 Republican primary. So fingers crossed, right?
Yeah.
But if not, there's always the book.
That's right.
So stay tuned.
And just one more note to add to that, as you will well know as well. But I mean, it's not as if the Republicans dipped from 66 to now they're hitting around 45% of the vote, so they just couldn't quite get that last chunk. I mean, in the elections in the 70s,
brutal.
they're obliterated by these candidates.
Yeah, and
And they're not nominating. I mean, I forget exactly which. It's 74 or 78 when they nominate Rodney Mims Cook.
78. In 78, Rodney Mims Cook. The interesting thing about Cook was he was the chairman of the party in 77, 78. And party rules at the time said the chairman couldn't run for governor. But they literally could not recruit somebody because Georgia had changed the Constitution. George Busby, who is the quintessential boring business progressive managerial sort of receivership governor, he's a lock. He's a shoo-in. Even with the you're not going to tag him because 78's the tax revolts. You're not going to tag George Busby as this high tax liberal. You're just not. So they couldn't get a candidate, and so there was a guy. I think he was a tombstone salesman. His name was Uncle Bud, or something like that. And they're like, we can't have Uncle Bud at the top of the ticket. So they changed the rules, and Rodney Cook runs as good a campaign as can be expected. But the poor man only got like 19% of the vote.
Right, but he was not like a. Like you say, like a
he wasn't an Uncle Bud.
He was a former council.
He was
member
almost mayor of Atlanta.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like a lot of these candidates in the 70s. I mean, Fletcher Thompson in the 72 Senate race is another example. It's not like, as was the case for some Southern Republican parties, they can't find anyone qualified to run. They've got qualified candidates, and they're getting blown out of the water.
And Fletcher Thompson had all the tailwinds.
Yeah, absolutely.
He had the tailwind behind him with Nixon at the top of the ticket and McGovern.
Sitting congressman, 4-term congressman or whatever that point.
66,
three-term.
Yeah, three-term. Redistricting got him in the end. But that like you said, that 72 Senate election, and I think Nunn wins that with about 54% of the vote. And the Republican Party statewide is not to be heard from again until 1980.
No.
Which again, if you look at 1980, hardly a backlash election against Herman Talmadge.
Tough to run that one, right?
Right. It's tough to make that argument. It's not 1980 also was a very strange election for and obviously this is beyond the scope of your book. But Senator Mattingly's won that race thanks in large part. Yes, he got 80% of the vote in Cobb County, which God bless. You're going to do well. But 30% of the African American vote. For a Republican to win 30% of the African American vote is just simply unheard of.
Right. But that just to circle back on 72 again, I think that because one of the other things that I was writing about also is the other issues that are really quite potent that don't necessarily just get the same coverage. And again, I do think race is the biggest single factor influencing politics, but I think in 72, the worry that Nunn has with McGovern is not that McGovern was in favor of desegregation, it's McGovern's view on Vietnam and foreign policy.
And everything else.
So, because Nunn in that race is not, the older tradition of sort of the more moderate Democrat was to kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink on the black vote and be like, well, I'm just not going to say much about it. We'll meet, in the back door of the building and try and negotiate with some, black leaders.
Right.
But Nunn is out there, openly campaigning with African American leaders and welcoming endorsements from it. So he is not trying to hide from that. I mean, he's not pushing like an aggressive pro-busing line or anything, but he's definitely signaling to people like, I welcome black support. I'm, glad to endorse it. But on Vietnam, he is like, we are not in the same group here.
Not unlike Senator Nunn's colleague who was running that year, Joe Biden.
Right.
Very much ran.
Whatever happened to him?
He had such great promise.
I know.
I don't know. He plagiarized Neil Kinnock. And we never heard from him since.
Yeah.
But you're right. It is you go from we already mentioned Carl Sanders, 10 years, which is not that long in terms of politics, although the last 10 years have felt excruciatingly long.
Yeah.
But Carl Sanders was hailed as this great liberal for saying he was a segregationist but not a damn fool.
Yep.
And it's like, well, my goodness, look at this paragon of Southern liberalism. this is fantastic. And 10 years later, from 64, 65, 68, that this has become that new era of the black and white coalition of the New South Democrats. They're sort of the night and day coalition that's going to hold together until, like you said, the 1990s, where you see significant deterioration of that coalition. So speaking of that, why do you think that coalition was able to hold together in the 70s and the 80s?
I think there's a number of things that help it do so. The first is, I would come back to my argument about agency, right? I think that often in the telling of the white backlash, Democrats are kind of like passive passengers that are either jumping ship. I'm going to mix metaphors here. They're either jumping ship or they're just letting it drift, right? Things are happening to them.
Right.
And I think that there's actually a much more deliberate effort and a pretty politically astute strategy by a big faction of the Democratic Party, certainly in Georgia, of saying, actually, this is where the future is going. I mean, even in Carl Sanders' time, the party chairman Fuqua is writing about, we need to make sure we're paying attention to the black vote. It's going to be crucial going forward. This is still with segregation on the books still. We can't openly push against it, but let's be honest, we see where this is heading. And there are people laying the ground for that. I think Carter is important in that as well. And there's by that point a well-established tradition of connections between the sort of African-American political elite, especially in the major cities, and the Democratic leaders, including even Talmadge. I mean, there's a letter I quote in the book from him in about '65 where various civil rights groups are pushing the Democratic Party to get an African-American voter registration drive person. I think his last name is, I want to say Booker, but I'm forgetting. I want to say Charles Booker, but that's a more recent candidate.
I was going to say, I think he's from Lexington.
Yeah, so I'm blurring
Louisville, Kentucky.
They're trying to, so these people like A.T. Walden and others are pushing the Democrats, you need to hire someone to get out the black vote. And Talmadge writes to the White House as well, saying, this guy's great. He's done great stuff in Fulton County, really helping us with turnout. Let's get him some money. Let's put him in charge of a Southern-wide. So he's even while he's still publicly spouting off about the Voting Rights Act, he's laying the groundwork. Like, once this passes, this is what's coming next. So there are pre-existing relationships. I think it's partly a deliberate political strategy, and I also think some Southern strategy Republicans got high on their own Kool-Aid. I think, and there are probably echoes here for 2022 as well. You see the big dramatic story. You see the Lester Maddox. At that point, you haven't yet seen Jesse Helms, but 72, you'll see that work as well. And they get a lot of attention, a lot of buzz. You're like, wow, this is the elixir, right? But I think there's a big block of voters, white voters, who are not racially progressive, but they also do not want to think of themselves as Dixiecrats. And if you make it too obvious, they'll vote for someone else. So, it's a little bit like the kind of the my black friend phenomenon, right? I see. This is a nice sort of innocuous George Busby standing there with NAACP. They're very. I admire that. They're a respectable organization. And then you've got the other side, waving the Dixie flag. And I know that's not what Cook did, but the Southern strategy, like Fletcher Thompson does that basically in '72.
Jimmy Bentley.
Exactly.
The joke about Jimmy Bentley was he wasn't running against Hal Sudi, he was running against the school bus.
Yeah.
That was his issue. It was, running commercials of, who's going to get on this bus next with your young white daughter, kind of. It just, like you say, there's hard hitting and then there's heavy handed and
yes.
Right. There were these lines that were clearly crossed, and like you said, the suburban voters who, again, not progressives by any stretch of the imagination, are put off by this.
Yeah.
And I think I want to get your thoughts on this. You talk about in the '60s, late '60s and '70s, the Democratic Party of Georgia, such as it was. And we can talk about the organizational strength and structure of the Democratic Party in a state that never really needed much of an organization apart from the governor. The Republicans handed them an incredible opportunity by severing ties in those big cities with the Republican Party after Goldwater.
Yeah.
When the Republican Party basically excommunicated the so-called Atlanta faction of the party that had been closely aligned with John Wesley Dobbs and John Calhoun, which is
my favorite name in this whole project.
Which is a very ironic name for a very influential African American Republican.
Yeah.
But basically severed those ties and said, you go from something like 30, 40, 50% of the black vote to a pittance in 64. And that's hard, and the Georgia Republican Party never comes back from that.
Yeah.
They never, 10, 12% or 30% if you're mathematically. How much of that night and day coalition, that alliance of black voters and white voters, is thanks to those choices made by not so much a backlash as benefiting it, but the backlash is actively hurting the Republican Party, especially in terms of African American votes?
So, I mean, you would be much better judged to answer that in terms of the internal dynamics within the Republican Party, but I do think it clears a lot of the field for some of these Georgia Democratic candidates if they play it smart, right? If they're going to go in, if George McGovern was going to run, that's not going to fly. But it creates a big opening for those sort of Chamber of Commerce, slightly boosterish, but racially at least modern, if not necessarily progressive, kind of candidates. The colorblind candidates,
right?
Just because no one's competing with them for it. And that's where, again, I think you asked about the '66 election earlier. I think it's that. I don't know if you've seen that meme with the little cartoon characters like reaching towards a target, and then it pans out and there's someone just holding him
the
back.
Monster,
And the '66 election is kind of that. It's the Republicans being like, we just need a few more white voters and we can be okay. And then there's like, well, demographic reality is like, actually, this is a false dawn. You were running against a complete wingnut here. I'm allowed to say that about Lester Maddox. You are running against.
You can't slander the dead.
No, you are running against a really extreme candidate, and you borrowed a lot of support that you haven't actually banked, and you're still coalition building. And I think, but that '66 outcome, at least in Georgia, I think sent the message of, oh well, we can jettison some of this stuff because the wave of the future is this direction, and it turned out it wasn't. And so, or at least it's only in the next 25, 30 years.
Well, and I think Callaway, who had won in '64. And he had outrun, to his credit, Goldwater in his district, but his '66 campaign was a shambles. It was very, very poor. He never truly pivoted away from running against Ellis Arnold.
Right.
And had Ellis Arnold been the candidate, all bets. I think Callaway probably wins.
I would imagine so.
Hard to say, but you weren't going to get to the right of Lester Maddox.
No, and I don't think he had a strategy for dealing with him because the other approach at that point, I mean, some more, I would argue, the more astute Georgia Republicans in the '90s now would probably put someone like Paul Coverdell in that kind of category. And he was already active as well by the '70s on the city council.
70 was his first campaign for state senate, I believe.
Is that, you ought to more overtly distance yourself from the kind of truly crazy backlash type of politics. And Callaway, he tiptoes around it. He almost says something to the point of well, I don't agree with just bashing someone's head in. But there's actually a lane to use there, right?
Right.
There's a decent chunk of those voters who are, well, I'm not really interested in, I think civil rights is okay, it's done now. We're not interested in going any further there, but I don't want this, I don't want anyone whipping it up anymore. And just to be this is the law and order type of campaign, but using it against the Maddox type, dramatic confrontation.
Well, and John Sibley and some of the Atlanta business establishment really tried to do that for Callaway.
Yeah.
And obviously you can lead a horse to water.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the Republicans perhaps having a lane to distance themselves and from sort of those backlashy style candidates. But one character, and character's a very kind way of describing him, that shows up constantly in the Democratic orbit that gives more mainstream Democrats a lane is somebody like J.B. Stoner, who an avowed white supremacist who would have been perfectly mainstream Democratic candidate in the 40s and 50s, but by the 70s and even into the 80s, here's this crazy, vehemently, wildly, nastily racist person.
Yeah.
Was that a boon to the Democrats to actually have him say in the mix, so you could, I'm not on camera, but basically this guy, or me?
That's I feel like it.
I don't want to overstate the influence of J.B. Stoner, but it's an interesting.
Well, I mean, there are times when that kind of foil can be helpful, right? I mean, I think if you're looking at the this is not answering your question directly, but if you look at the 48 election, Truman's facing a tough re-elect. Having, on the one hand, Thurmond and Wallace running against him is a problem because it could drain off support. On the other hand, it does give him that opening to be like, hey, you see this guy over here and you see this guy over here. I'm neither of those two things, and that helps you maybe support me. So I don't think Stoner has quite the same stature as Thurmond did in terms of impact.
Sure.
But as a political foil, that can be helpful to be like to have this, noise is off kind of thing where that's not, and just look at him and realize that's not me.
Right.
It can be a helpful dynamic. I don't know what the scale of that impact with someone like Stoner was, but.
So we mentioned earlier sort of the Democratic Party of Georgia, at the organization itself. What was the Democratic Party as an official organ during the period in which you were looking? How did it change over time?
So I would almost, and this is not by no means an original thought, this is very much in line with sort of V.O. Key and some of the earlier analysts on this, that the Democratic Party during the Solid South years is almost more of a network than a party, right? So the key players have their people in the various counties or cities that they connect with, and they're all Democrats in the sense that everyone at that point, outside of a few Atlanta suburbs and the African American votes in towns and cities, is a Democrat. But it's not really at that point that you sign up as like as it were, a dues-paying member of the party, and there's like a weekly get-together in your county. It's very much like, I'm picking up the phone and calling, Bob down in Savannah, and then I'm going to call, Jack over in Rome, and I'm going to get my information that way, and it's more that kind of network system, which is one of the things that the loyalist Democrats, or the more sort of pro-New Deal accommodationist as far as civil rights is concerned, Democrats are really worried about by the early 60s. It's like this is a hollow shell, right? This operates so long as there's some very powerful personalities with very well-established networks, but there's actually no organization to fall back on. So as soon as we face a real challenge, because the Republicans in Atlanta by that point, they have an organization. Now they're not yet winning outright, but they're getting closer, and so there's a definite effort by the 1960s, kind of a little bit like looking behind the curtain. This thing, you imagine it's all powerful because it's been winning every election, but actually,
it's a paper tiger when it come.
So there's then this more deliberate effort to try and create grassroots organizations, and in the 1960s, they sometimes, I think, actually this is speculation, but they somewhat, I think, underestimate the impact they could have. I think the Right in Georgia campaign is a good example. Like that grew out of a handful of people who had been working on party building, sort of saying, well, okay, let's give this a try. And it turns out that had a big impact. And then 2 years later, the challenge to the regular Maddox slate at the Democratic Convention is also basically these party activists, and who are perhaps realizing actually this is a format that works much more. And I think by the 70s, it's become more recognizable that there is a proper party structure of sorts. But I think that's the transition. I should maybe, as a qualifier, I think there are individual county Democratic organizations that are fully functioning before then.
Sure.
But I think on the statewide level, it's that network.
Right. And it's sort of like there's lots of good scholarship, especially from political scientists, on party structure and the strength of the parties. Dan Galvin wrote a book about presidential party building and the effects of when you control government, what that actually means for the party itself. Whereas in the UK, for example, you have these parallel, you have government and you have the party structure. Whereas here in the US, yeah, that's technically the case, and in the States, that's technically the case, but the real power in Georgia ran through the governor's office and the speaker's chair. So, yeah, there could be a party that could do all those little party things, but if you always had the governor and speaker to fall back on, which they did until 2002, which, again, not an original argument on my part, but why did the Democrats crumble so quickly? They had nothing, there was nothing there. They had the governor.
Yeah.
And that was it. They could not rebound because they had nothing to fall back on in terms of recruitment and fundraising and everything else. But yeah, stepping back from the book or the actual history itself, and thinking about it in terms of historiography, you've mentioned your work, Matt Lassiter. We could also talk, Kevin Cruz,
alumni
Joe
of this
Crispino.
school.
What's that?
Kevin Cruz was an alumni of this school.
I did not know that.
Class
I did
of
not
90.
know that. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, as you're, I'm sure you're contractually obligated to mention those things.
I was waiting, but I got it in.
There,
Yeah.
I'll have to email Kevin and say, well, we have to do an interview now. Since, in historical circles, you're sitting here with two historians. You're a historian yourself. We're familiar with these debates. Sort of the backlash thesis, this sort of, counter narrative to the backlash thesis. How much, though, would you say that yours and Matt's and Kevin Cruz's interpretation has broken through into the mainstream of political thought and I hate to use the term punditry, but punditry?
Well, I would say in punditry terms, the most simplified version of the white backlash thesis has definitely broken through. It's become, I think you mentioned Kevin Cruz has done a ton of great work on this and many other elements of history. I think he leans a little closer towards the white backlash explanation. But it's still a very nuanced, careful, contingent. It's not the version that just comes out whenever they have a panel together on MSNBC about why didn't the Democrats win X southern state. So
well, you see 1964.
Right. Yeah. So yes, that's right. So I think that one has. Now, if we're going slightly beyond the punditry level, I think if you're looking at actual political operatives in southern states right now, and I, by no means am I thinking they're trawling the footnotes of my book or anything like that, but this argument about
they will now.
how political change actually happens. I think, Kevin Cruz would be definitely a good example of this. I think his views have broken through there. He is as much a sort of public intellectual as a historian now in terms of.
Sure, absolutely.
There are a ton of political operatives who know who he is, and so he has been able to communicate a ton of really important contextual stuff about the backstory of Southern politics that your 21-year-old campaign manager might not know. So I think on that level, it has been breaking through, and I think the book he's about to write or publish on myths in American history. I think those kind of things will register. I don't think it's going to, the morning roundtable on, I can pick any cable channel now, but I won't slander any of them. But the standard morning roundtable is still going to probably rely on
the backlash,
and it's in its most simplistic iteration, right? Democrats haven't actually won any election since 1964 in any southern race of any kind, right? It just disappeared.
Well, in talking about oversimplification, I can remember, starting graduate school, and this is a fault of I don't want to blame graduate students, but early career and folks who are looking to stake a claim, in the scholarly field is they sort of boil down these reductive. It's like this is a backlash thesis, or Tim Boyd and Matt Lasseter, they ignore race. They don't think race is important at all. Which is not the argument that either you or Professor Lasseter are making. And I think you said it earlier, which you say race is absolutely the single most important factor by a long way in terms of Southern politics. Your intervention was saying there are other really important things too that extend beyond. You stop sort of the classical civil rights movement, but your argument is they extend far beyond that.
Yes. And to add also that within the topic of race, I think there's a temptation, and the pundits are again the most guilty of this, of being like, race is voting rights and civil rights. And I would also argue that the most powerful racial appeals made in Southern politics more recently have tended to be about crime, maybe welfare, and not that people in the 60s didn't buy into those tropes, but the idea that the primary motivating thing is like, well, restaurants aren't allowed to keep the black people out anymore. I don't think that's
racism is over.
Yeah, but I don't think like the terms of the 64 Civil Rights Act or the 65 Voting Rights Act are the most salient racial issues in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. I think race. So in other words, race itself is more than just that one moment, and that one issue, or those two issues, I guess.
Right. You can go for zoning, school districts,
absolutely,
taxation.
Yes. I mean, the famous Jesse Helms ad isn't it outrageous that these African American people can vote? It's affirmative action and employment, right? It's definitely a racial appeal, overtly racial appeal, but the topic is not let's repeal the Voting Rights Act.
Right. Well, as we sit here, there's a very strong likelihood that these cases are going to be taken up by a newly conservative Supreme Court. So, these issues that you're talking about in your book, that I'm talking about in my dissertation, and have been talked about over and over and over. These aren't dead issues.
No.
So they're still incredibly salient.
But very quickly on that, telling also that there's probably a good chunk of the Republican leadership now that would benefit and knows it would benefit if the voting rights protections were removed, but they didn't want to do that through Congress and recorded votes, right? Because that looks terrible. Much easier or better politically to have it kind of gutted by the judicial system, because it doesn't put you on the record as having voted it down.
Right. And that's Democrat, Republican. Whenever the Supreme Court, whoever benefits from the court's decision, this is above politics. This is the high court.
Here it is.
What can I do
on this slab of stone carved in?
And the Ed Stone. So, how do you think your book? And we've talked about this in bits and pieces. But how do you think your book, your scholarship, can help us understand the sort of transformations that Georgia politics is undergoing right now, especially in the Trump and I won't say post-Trump era because we're still in the Trump era. How does it help us understand or contextualize this current moment in Georgia politics?
I would hope that part of it is the message that the process itself is a little messier and non-linear and not singularly focused than people sometimes like to think. In other words, there's what is the one key that will unlock how to win an election in Georgia? The issues there'll be some constancy, but it will morph and shift over time, and in certain contexts, some of those issues will become more salient and some less salient. And that from the standpoint of ordinary voters, which is also part of the message here, they're not all sitting there thinking in grand historical sweeping terms about what am I voting on or for. It's often they have contradictory thoughts. They have issues that they care about sometimes and not others. And that political change happens in that way. It's not going to be like a thunderbolt kind of moment. Secondly, that the interplay is often at the state level. And I think here, this is perhaps something that Democrats in particular fell short on in the last 15 years, maybe late 2000, around 2010 certainly. This idea that the national trajectory will carry everything along, and state politics, state parties aren't that crucial, and that left a huge lane for state Republican parties to dominate states and actually with major consequences for policy.
Tennessee, for example,
is a good example of that. And actually, just on Tennessee, we talked about what happens when the party structure atrophies. I can't remember the lady's name now, but there used to be for a long time a woman who lived outside of Memphis and basically ran those western Tennessee counties, rural counties outside of Memphis for the Democrats. And even into the Harold Ford Jr. race in 2006, which was really the last competitive open seat the Democrats had in Tennessee, was pulling in great numbers from there. But it was her machine, and when she was no longer there, it's almost we've just vacated the field. So it's a similar kind of phenomenon, right? That you need that structure in place, and this habit that sometimes parties have of leaving seats uncontested on the basis they're not going to win them. Is that obviously you've got to focus resources. You can't pour equal attention into every race, but if you just don't put up anyone, your party's atrophy. Yeah. And the difference we know now, the difference between posting 15% in a rural county and 25%, huge statewide.
Right, exactly. If we're talking Democratic politics, you don't have to win. Look at Georgia. We have a runoff election again. Depending on what interview you watch at what point, you'll have no idea what we're talking about here. It's not like Reverend Senator Warnock is going to win for Forsyth County and Cherokee County.
No.
He's not going to win those counties. Maybe in 2040 those counties are trending more Democratic, but if he's able to pull 42%, 44%, even a little less in Forsyth or in Cherokee County, that's enough. That's enough because that rural base of the Republican Party, which of course was the rural base of the Democratic Party back then, that's a dwindling population base, and eventually you can't squeeze any more blood from that stone. So it's really the story of my dissertation was really suburbs, and now in sort of the post 2002, post 2010 really story is the story of the exurbs.
Absolutely.
Holding and propping up the Republican Party in Georgia.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
And I think, and also in line with that, when we're talking about how these political changes often happen, I think there's the old-fashioned sort of top-down history version, which is, the leaders get together and boldly proclaim that change is going to happen. And then there's the kind of slightly romanticized, idealistic version of 10,000 people poured out into the streets and these cynical old politicians finally adjusted. And I think a lot of the changes that happen as the Democratic Party in that era adjusted to civil rights is kind of a merging of those two things, right? There's actually, there's some very idealistic activists, and they are drawing great attention to the issue. Then they have, this is within the civil rights movement, there's the more kind of pragmatic leaders of the organizations who are negotiating with one faction of the party. Meanwhile, there's a more resisting group out there, and the interplay between all those groups is what ultimately causes change to happen. It's not, one of them doesn't have a monopoly on the agency to make things happen.
I was talking to some of Senator Herman Talmadge's former staffers, and they were talking about that challenge from Maynard Jackson in '68 as being the staff knew it. The staff who were more liberal than Herman Talmadge was knew that those changes that you discussed needed to be made, and here's Herman Talmadge, son of Gene Talmadge, who was pushing the private school amendment for years and years and years, but he recognized the fact that Maynard Jackson was a force, even though he won, but recognized that to survive he had to change, and he did for 12 more years anyway. So, and I think we're sitting here in the era of post Citizens United, super PACs and everything like that, small dollar donations, Act Blue, red win red, whatever the Republican effort to match that is win red, I think. That I think a lot of folks think that parties don't matter anymore, and that we don't really need parties. We have the internet, we have Twitter, we have mass communication, we can tweet directly at our candidates and things like that. But what you're saying is, when a little old lady in West Tennessee dies, the machine can go with her.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really instructive in Nevada, this
Yes.
being the first election without Harry Reid in Harry Reid's machine, and that the Democrats were able to hold on. Well, not hold the governor's mansion. That's a separate question with Sisolak, but that Catherine Cortez Masto was able to hold on without Harry Reid.
Right, but still, and that was exactly the example I was thinking of as well. So I think that is a good, really on point for this, because there's also within Nevada then this tension where the state party has technically been taken over by, a much more left-wing group than the Reid machine represents, and now they're
that showed its force in the 2020 primary.
Yeah,
Bernie
as well.
Sanders absolutely
but
wrong.
now they are now seeking in one sense to claim credit for the Cortez Masto win, which is, there was a great interview with John Ralston just about that very phenomenon, right? Like the state party itself is actually still, basically in his version, they do press releases and grand statements, but actually the work of the party is being done by this independent machine, and if the money dries up for that machine, there's going to be real trouble.
Yeah, you mentioned John Ralston. The state of Nevada does not need to spend money on elections. They just need to have John Ralston proclaim what the results will be, and so it will be.
Exactly. It's much
the man
more
efficient. He's a magician.
Yeah.
I don't know how he does it. There's some sort of black magic involved. But. Well, Tim, you're here at MBA. Are you able to teach any of your research interests or topics in your classes here to the next generation of aspiring history students / astronauts?
Not so much in my own classes. My own classes are currently European history. I have taught some American history classes here as well. I'm not currently teaching those, and definitely I didn't think ahead of time enough to make my book like the textbook for the class. That really would have bumped the sales up nicely. But we definitely used some of the materials from it when I did that, and I have had still opportunities to put together some papers for panels and conferences, and in the meantime as well.
Yeah.
So I've been able to keep those things ticking over, but it hasn't been a part of the teaching I've been doing here, at least for the last few years.
Right. Well, maybe when the kids are a little bit older, we'll put together a panel and we can go on the road and do the Democratic and Republican parties of Georgia road show.
Yeah, I think that was in that thing you made me sign, wasn't
it?
Yeah,
I believe it's an incredibly complex legal document.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. So, if you have it in you, and this is an Easter egg for people who made it to the very end, explain the rules of cricket to an American.
Oh, very good. Okay, so
on the spot, go.
On the spot. Well, there is a student of mine actually gave me a nice summary of this. We have a cricket club here at Montgomery Bell, which is the undefeated state championship.
I assured Alec that you started the cricket club.
Correct.
And there was not one here.
There was not.
For some reason.
I know, a gross oversight, giving this claims to be educating citizens of the world.
I mean, athlete. It's on the
right
sign
there.
outside.
It's right there. And having no opposition, bit like the Democratic Party in the 1950s. There's no opposition, so we just keep winning. But one of the students who took part in it gave me like this nice one-paragraph summary about cricket. There's 2 teams of 11. One team is in, and the other team is out. The team that is out tries to get the team that is in out, and the team that is in tries to stop the team that is out from getting the ones who are in out. And when the team that is in is out, the team that is out comes in and tries to outscore the team that was in but is now out, unless the team that is now out can get the team that is now in out before they've got as much as the team that was in had scored before they were out.
Perfectly clear. Absolutely.
The perhaps more useful version is, it's a more complicated / sophisticated, delete as appropriate, version of baseball. All the basic principles of baseball are going to apply: runs, outs, batting lineups, pitching / bowling. A lot of overlap with the skills. The one crucial difference, I would say, baseball, the currency of the game is runs.
Yeah.
In cricket, the currency of the game is outs. So if you offered a baseball manager, you can have 1 out or 1 run, they'll be like, I'll take that run, please. And if you offer a cricket captain, you can have 1 run or 1 out, they'll say, I'll take the out.
Okay. Now that's a new wrinkle that I've never thought about. Is the outs are the precious, the lifeblood, and not necessarily the runs.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, why no gloves? Why not just get a glove?
Well, there's one. The wicketkeeper, so the catcher, wears gloves. Otherwise, no one wears gloves. Partly because sometimes the ball is coming to you at very close range. So there's a lot of fielding positions in cricket that are very close to where the batter is, and it's easier with your bare hands to adjust to the flight of the ball. Honestly, beyond that, I don't know how people sometimes judge a catch of a ball in a web rather than in their hands. When I used to play softball occasionally, and the one athletic triumph of the Vanderbilt history department was winning the intramural softball competition one year.
That's not nothing.
I would field in the outfield because having played cricket, I had a decent throwing arm. But if a fly ball came out, I would throw the glove off to field it, and then throw it. It just felt weird to have the glove on the hand.
Oh, that's why you have gnarled fingers.
It is exactly. It's why this finger still doesn't bend all the way down properly.
And that, friends, is why we use 2 hands and a glove.
And don't do the crocodile catch. That was the coach always explain that as well. Catch like that, not like that.
Yeah, sounds like I'm explaining this to my 7-year-old. Yeah, here.
Yeah. Well, now you have all you need to set up a club at the University of Georgia.
Yeah, well, the first time I ever saw it, cricket played, it was between 2 teams of international students, Indian students and Pakistani students. Sort of the Commonwealth international students would play it at the intramural fields. We had a softball game, and we had to wait for the cricketers to move on.
And that game can take 5 days, so that's a
that's. I remember the first time we ever got was it ESPN Plus? It was ESPN 3 or whatever, and there's cricket on all the time because it's played in all over the world, and you can watch Sri Lanka play New Zealand, and I'll watch it, and it's like I got nothing here.
Yeah.
No. So I'm the ugly American. It is I. Well, Tim, thank you again so much for doing this. We'll have to get you back down to Georgia at some point.
I'd love that.
Visit the Russell Library, folks.
Yeah.
If we can extricate you from your familial and professional duties at some point. But thanks again for taking the time this morning, this chilly morning in Nashville, Tennessee, to talk Georgia politics with us.
Glad to do it. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.